The mainstream media is working overtime to perpetuate the myth of the Bernie bro. Emphasis on the word myth there, because that's just not true. Now, if you don't know, the Bernie bro that they try to tell you is the typical Sanders supporter is the straight white male who just goes online and spews vitriolic, racist, and sexist things at anyone and everyone who utters a bad word about Bernie Sanders. This is just not true. This is not true at all. So the fact of the matter is Bernie Sanders has the most diverse coalition of any other candidate running for the Democratic primary in 2020. That's the fact of the matter is. And the fact that the media keeps trying to portray the Bernie bro as the straight white male standard supporter erases that diverse coalition that we've been working so hard to build since 2016. The myth of the Bernie bro was tried out in 2016, and they're trotting it out again in 2020 because when they can't argue with you on policy, they'll try to smear your supporters. They can't argue with policies that are supported by a majority of Americans, like Medicare for all, tuition-free public colleges and universities, a living wage. They can't argue with that because the majority of Americans support those ideas. So their next step is to try to smear the coalition of Sanders supporters. And they do it by erasing people of color, women of color, the diverse coalition that we have. And even when talking about it online, the type of disgusting language that they use to describe Sanders supporters, like a swarm, right? They say a swarm of Sanders supporters incoming, like we're just a bunch of insects. That's disgusting to me. But in any case, this is a myth that the mainstream media, and particularly NBC, trotted out last night during the 9th Democratic primary debate. So I think Sanders did a strong job at defending the base. I think he could have done a little bit better in his response, but it was heartening to see him defend his supporters and not allow this myth to continue to be perpetuated. So let's take a look at his response and then discuss.
We have over 10.6 million people on Twitter, and 99.9% of them are decent human beings, are working people, are people who believe in justice, compassion, and love. And if there are a few people who make ugly remarks, who attack trade union leaders, I disown those people. They are not part of our movement. But let me also say what I hope my friends up here will agree with, is that if you look at the Wild West of the Internet, talk to some of the African-American women on my campaign, talk to Senator Nina Turner, talk to others, and find the vicious, racist, sexist attacks that are coming their way as well. So I would hope that all of us understand that we should do everything we possibly can to end the viciousness and ugliness on the Internet. Our campaign is about issues. It's about fighting for the working families and the middle class. It is not about vicious attacks on other people.
Senator, when you say that you disown these attacks and you didn't personally direct them, I believe you.
Well, thank you.
But at a certain point, you got to ask yourself, why did this pattern arise? Why is it especially the case among your supporters?
I don't think it is especially the case, by the way.
That's just not true. Look,
well,
people know.
Pete, if you want to talk to some of the women on my campaign, what you will see is the most ugly, sexist, racist attacks that are, I won't even describe them here, they're so disgusting. And let me say something else about this, not being too paranoid. All of us remember 2016. And what we remember is efforts by Russians and others to try to interfere in our election and divide us up. I'm not saying that's happening, but it would not shock me. I saw some of those tweets regarding the Culinary Workers Union. I have a 30-year, 100% pro-union voting record. Do you think I would support, or anybody supports me, would be attacking union leaders? It's not thinkable.
So I think this was a strong answer by Bernie, and I think he did a good job at flipping the narrative of this whole thing. In his response, he said that 99.9% of his supporters are people who just want all of those policies, like I mentioned before. And it's the tiny, tiny, tiny portion of his base that's spewing these vitriolic things, which I think is a fair assessment of the situation. But then he goes a step further and he says, hey, look at the abuse that my supporters are getting from other people. Like, take a look at Nina Turner's mentions on Twitter, and you'll see a lot of the same things that you're accusing my supporters of doing, which is true. If you go into her mentions, if you go into the mentions of any Bernie supporters, they have said some vile things about Bernie supporters, but they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about that. And the thing is, back in 2016, there was a survey about who the most aggressive supporters of the 2016 race were. So some of the three main people in 2016 were Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders. In this study, of those three people, Bernie Sanders had the least perceived aggressive supporters. He was at 16% perception of aggressiveness. And his supporters of those three people were seen as the least aggressive. Okay? That's data. That's cold hard facts that support this idea, or at least debunk the idea, that the typical Bernie supporter is someone who's vitriolic and aggressive online. Now, using that data and extending it to 2020, Bernie Sanders has a lot of the same messages as he had in 2016. So I would imagine that that's the case again for this Democratic primary season. Now, Mayor Pete says that's not true, that Sanders supporters aren't aggressive. And props to Bernie for pushing back against that, because that's a lie. Like, you don't know whether or not that's true, Pete. You don't have any data, you don't have any statistics to back up that Sanders supporters are the most aggressive people online. I've seen some pretty disgusting things from Buttigieg supporters on Twitter as well. So unless you're going to back up what you're saying with facts or statistics that Bernie supporters are the most aggressive out of any other of the Democratic candidates, then I'm just going to call you a liar, because that's what it is. You have no proof, no statistics to back up your support. And while Bernie pushed back against that, I think he could have pushed back against that more in citing that in 2016 his supporters were seen as the least aggressive of the three big campaigns that I mentioned before, and citing that, hey, you have no statistics, no support to back up what you're saying. What you're saying is just not true. And I wish he would have pointed out that saying the Bernie bro, the swarm language, is just disgusting and erases people like me, our support of his candidacy. So I think overall it was a pretty strong answer, and I think Pete was being pretty disingenuous there, of saying, yeah, no, you guys are the most aggressive, despite having no evidence to support that claim. At least on our side, we have a little bit of evidence from the 2016 survey that was done, but they literally have no leg to stand on. So they are attempting to smear us as supporters and saying, well, this person's unelectable because their supporters are mean. The fact of the matter is, I think Twitter is a medium where people who are in the 99% are finally able to push back on these lies that people in the mainstream establishment have been telling for years and years and years, and they don't like that. They're used to their DC bubbles where they can just say things without any sort of pushback. Like some of the disgusting things, like that woman on MSNBC who said, Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl and I don't know why. This is the type of stuff that we're pushing back on. We're pushing back on people that say Medicare for All will bankrupt the nation, when the fact of the matter is that it will net save us money. When we push back on that with facts and numbers, they don't like to hear that, and they see all of that as us being aggressive when we're just pointing out policy differences.